Hi, I'm Avon. Last Thanksgiving, I asked my grandpa one simple question. Do you like the lake house I gave you? He froze. His hands shook. And then he said words I'll never forget. What house? I never got anything. That's when I looked at my parents and watched their faces go white. They weren't just lying. They'd stolen everything I gave him. Money, property, years of trust. I thought silence was love. But in my family, silence was how they destroyed me. What would you do if the people you trusted most rewrote you as the villain? Before we dive in, let me ask, what time are you listening? And where? Drop your answer below. I'm listening. Because what happened next? It didn't just break a promise. It broke me. Thanksgiving mornings used to be my favorite. Growing up, it meant the smell of turkey slow roasting, Grandpa's voice humming old songs from the kitchen, and me, always me, running between the table and the oven, pretending to help. This year it felt heavier. I could tell the second I woke up. Maybe it was the silence, or the way the air outside felt like it was pressing against the windows. Cold. Still. Like it knew something I didn't. I'd arrived 2 days early. Mom said she was too tired to prepare, that since you're the one still single with free time, I could handle the cooking. I didn't argue. Arguing with Delora never ends well. So, there I was. Sleeves rolled up, apron on, basting a turkey twice my size in the same chipped roasting pan we'd used every year. The house smelled right. Turkey, cranberries, a hint of pumpkin spice. It even looked right. The small lakeside home where I grew up still carried its memories. Scuffed floors, faded curtains, and walls that had heard too many arguments. But somehow, nothing felt right. Not anymore. I tried not to think about it. By noon, everyone else had shown up. Uncle Cal drifted in first, always late, always alone. Dad, Rylan, came down from his home office pretending he hadn't been hiding up there all morning, and Mom, Delora, had been holding court at the kitchen island since breakfast, criticizing my stuffing and suggesting I use less sage next time. Then Grandpa Jonah arrived. I don't know why, but seeing him shuffle up the porch steps hit me harder than usual. He looked smaller. His old fishing jacket hung loose over his shoulders, but when he spotted me, his eyes lit up like they always did. "My little helper," he rasped, reaching out. I hugged him carefully, fighting the lump in my throat. "I saved your seat, Grandpa." I led him to his chair at the end of the table, the spot he'd claimed since forever. Then I placed something special in front of him, a linen napkin, old but clean, with the words "Grandpa's Girl" embroidered in pale blue. He blinked at it, then at me, and smiled. That napkin was my anchor, the one thing that still felt real. The meal itself, or what passed for it, dragged like usual. Conversations were forced. Delora steered everything. Dad barely spoke. Uncle Cal scrolled his phone. Grandpa ate slowly, listening more than talking. And me? I was doing what I always did. Trying to keep everyone together, trying to pretend we were still a family. But I could feel it unraveling. And then, I asked the question. I don't know why. Maybe it was the way Grandpa seemed lost in thought, staring out the window between bites of turkey. Maybe it was how quiet the table had gotten. Or maybe I just wanted him to feel remembered. I smiled at him, trying to sound casual. "Grandpa, do you like the lake house I gave you last year?" The room froze. Even before he spoke, I knew something was wrong. Grandpa Jonah blinked slowly. His fork hovered mid-air. He looked at me, puzzled, then at Dad, then Mom. His hand trembled slightly. "What house?" he asked softly. "I never got any house." Silence. I stopped breathing. The warmth, the fake cheerfulness, vanished like someone had cracked open a window in midwinter. Cold seeped in. I looked at Mom. Delora's face had gone white. Her knuckles tightened around her wine glass so hard I thought it might break. Dad stared at his plate, motionless. Uncle Cal glanced up from his phone, frowning. And Grandpa looked hurt. I don't understand, he murmured, glancing between all of us like a lost child. Avon. What house? I couldn't speak, couldn't move. Because in that moment, every memory I'd buried surfaced. I remembered the phone call from Mom last year, how she said Grandpa wasn't well enough to handle property management, that it would stress him out. She'd promised, "Transfer the house to us, sweetie. We'll handle everything for him." I trusted her. I believed my own mother. I had signed the transfer papers without thinking twice. I trusted them. And now, Grandpa sat there, bewildered, while my parents looked like ghosts in their own kitchen. Something inside me cracked. I looked back at Delora, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in my mother's eyes. For a moment, no one spoke. I sat there staring at my mother, the silence pressing in around me like the walls themselves had ears. Then, Delora blinked and shifted in her seat as if nothing had happened. Her voice came light, rehearsed, almost casual. "Oh, Dad's confused again. Aren't you, Jonah?" She leaned forward slightly, her smile tight enough to crack. "He forgets things sometimes, Avon. You know that." My grandfather didn't argue. He looked down at his plate, his fork still resting mid-air, as if he wasn't sure what he was supposed to say. His eyes, sharp just minutes earlier, now seemed dulled. I felt my stomach twist. "I'm not confused," he said softly. But even he didn't sound convinced. My mother ignored him completely. She turned to me with that same brittle smile, shaking her head gently, like I was the child here. "You shouldn't ask things like that, honey. It just upsets him. Let's not make today harder than it already is, all right?" She reached across the table, almost like she wanted to pat my hand. I pulled mine back. My father kept his eyes on his plate, chewing slowly, as if the turkey had suddenly become the most fascinating thing he'd ever tasted. I sat frozen, unsure whether to feel embarrassed, angry, or just stupid. Maybe all three. I glanced at Grandpa again. He still hadn't lifted his gaze. He just sat there, small and silent, as if whatever strength he'd walked in with had been taken from him. Was I wrong? I replayed the last year in my mind like a film reel that wouldn't stop. I remembered the house, the small lake property I'd bought. Not fancy, but it was peaceful, quiet. Grandpa always talked about retiring near the water again, and I'd wanted to give him that. I remembered signing the transfer papers. Mom said she and Dad would handle the rest, that managing property taxes would overwhelm him. "It's better if we put it under our names first, just for the paperwork." "Don't worry, sweetie. We'll make sure it gets to him," she'd said, brushing me off like I was overthinking. I'd believed her. I believed them. Now, sitting there at that table, I felt the beginnings of shame settle into my chest. Was I naive? Did I fail him? I forced myself to eat a few bites of turkey, though the food tasted like ash in my mouth. The table had fallen into strained silence. Grandpa pushed his food around, barely touching it. My mother, for all her earlier chatter, seemed content to sip her wine now. She kept glancing at Grandpa's glass and refilling it too often, even though he hadn't asked. I kept watching her, watching both of them, every movement, every look. Then something caught my eye. On the far side of the dining room, built into the old wooden sideboard, there was a drawer, one I hadn't paid attention to before. Earlier, when I was setting the table, I'd seen Mom slip some papers into it. At the time, I hadn't thought twice. Now, I wondered, why would my mother lock a drawer during Thanksgiving dinner? My thoughts spun faster. What if the house transfer wasn't the only thing? I reached for my wine, took a sip, then realized my hands were shaking. At some point, Delora looked over and smiled at me again. "You always worry too much, sweetheart." I felt the words like a slap. The same words she used when I was little, when I cried after finding her drunk in the garage and she told me it was just grown-up sadness. The same tone, the same dismissal. The worst part? A part of me still wanted to believe her. After all, she's my mother. By the time dinner wound down, everyone was pretending nothing had happened. Plates were scraped clean out of habit, not hunger. Dad asked Uncle Cal about work just to fill the silence. I couldn't breathe in that room anymore. I excused myself, claiming I needed the restroom, but instead of walking down the hall, I stopped just past the doorway, leaning my back against the cold hallway wall. I stood there for a long time, my heart racing, listening to the muted clinks of silverware and fake laughter behind me. I felt stupid, humiliated, and worse, I felt responsible. I trusted them. I believed my own parents over my own instincts. And now, I pressed my palms flat against the wall, feeling the chill seep into my skin. They were hiding something. I could feel it in my bones. I thought of Grandpa sitting there, too quiet. The way my mother's voice shifted when she lied. The locked drawer. I closed my eyes. Whatever they were keeping from me, I needed to find out, even if the truth burned. I didn't sleep that night. I tried. For hours I lay in the old guest bed, listening to the faint creaks of this house that once felt like home. Every sound made me flinch. Around midnight I heard it, the soft slide of the sideboard drawer opening. My mother. I stayed still, holding my breath. My heart pounded so loud I was sure she'd hear it, but nothing followed. No talking, no movement, just the drawer. And then quiet again. Why would you need to hide what's yours? That question gnawed at me until dawn. By the time the sun was just a pale line over the lake, I'd made up my mind. Downstairs, the house was still. Grandpa Jonah must have gone back to sleep after the long evening. I could hear his soft breathing from the den, where they'd set up a recliner for him. My parents' bedroom door remained closed. I stepped into the dining room, my bare feet cold against the floorboards. The sideboard sat there, harmless, unassuming. But I knew better. The drawer wasn't locked with anything fancy, just an old latch. I pulled a bobby pin from my hair, hesitated, then bent it carefully the way I used to when I locked myself out of my diary as a teenager. It took less than a minute. When the latch clicked open, my stomach tightened. Inside, everything was too neat. A stack of envelopes, some bank forms, a few documents tucked in a brown folder. Nothing looked alarming. Nothing screamed betrayal. But the name on those envelopes? My name. I pulled them out with shaking hands, one by one, unopened. Beneath them, I found the deed. The property transfer. My handwriting right there on the signature line under Avon Lark. But the line beneath it, the one for Grandpa Jonah, blank. It wasn't signed. I stared at it, willing it to change, to explain itself. But the paper stayed silent. They never delivered it. The realization hit me like ice water. My parents hadn't just forgotten, or delayed. They'd chosen not to hand it over. I flipped through more papers, desperate now, bank transfers, the ones I remembered authorizing months ago, payments set aside for Grandpa's medical expenses, his property taxes. Except the recipient account wasn't his. The routing numbers didn't match. I didn't recognize the destination account at all. I felt the blood drain from my face. My legs nearly gave out, and I sank onto the nearest chair, documents clutched in both hands, everything I'd worked for, everything I'd saved to make sure Grandpa had what he needed. Gone. Stolen. I trusted them. I sat there for I don't know how long, the documents spread out like pieces of my own stupidity. Images from childhood flickered in my mind. My mother telling me, over and over, family first, We protect each other. We never doubt blood. But those words felt hollow now. A rehearsed lie, meant to keep me obedient. How long had they been using that line to keep me quiet, to make me give without question? The weight in my chest turned from sorrow to something else. Anger. Quiet, burning, steady. I stood up slowly. I restacked the documents, smoothing them carefully. My hands still shook, but my mind felt eerily clear. I placed everything back exactly where I found it. Closed the drawer. Locked it. Then I walked down the hall to the bathroom. I caught my reflection in the mirror above the sink. I looked pale, tired, older, but my eyes, they weren't soft anymore. I leaned in close and whispered to myself, "They'll tell me the truth. Or I'll burn everything down to get it." And that morning, as the sun rose over the lake, I stopped being their daughter. By the time the morning sunlight stretched over the lake, I was already in the kitchen, standing by the coffee maker, watching the dark brew drip into the pot. I didn't need caffeine, I just needed something to do with my hands. I heard her footsteps before I saw her. My mother. Delora walked in like it was any other morning. She glanced at me, then looked away, moving to the cupboard for a mug. Her casual hum felt rehearsed, like someone playing a part they'd memorized too long. I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because I needed her to speak first. "Morning," she said eventually, her voice light, as if the night before hadn't happened. I poured coffee into her mug without asking, sliding it across the counter toward her. She hesitated, then took it. We stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound between us. Then I asked it, soft, flat, no anger. "Why did you lie to me about the lake house?" She stopped mid-sip. Her knuckles whitened around the handle of the cup. When she looked at me, her face was calm, too calm. "I didn't lie to you, Avon." Her tone was gentle, patronizing. "Your grandfather, he wouldn't have used that place properly. You know that." I just stared. She sighed like I was the difficult one, like she was tired of having to explain simple things. "We kept it for the family's sake. Your father and I. We made that decision together." "For the family's sake," I repeated quietly. She nodded, sipping her coffee like the matter was settled. "You're young. You don't understand family politics. These things, they're more complicated than you realize." I felt something crack inside me then. Not a snap, not a break, just a slow, splintering crack. I thought about all those years, every time I'd trusted her. Every time I'd believed her when she said she was doing what was best for everyone. I swallowed hard. "The money, too?" She didn't flinch. "The money was used for family emergencies, things you wouldn't have known about." She smiled gently, like she was indulging a child. "That money wouldn't have helped him much. This way, it helped all of us." My stomach turned. I couldn't find words at first. Then she added, almost offhandedly, "Besides, what you gave him, it was more of a symbolic gesture. He wouldn't have appreciated it the way you thought he would." A symbolic gesture. My savings. My gift. The home I thought I was giving to the man who raised me when no one else cared. I realized in that moment, my mother had never seen me as capable. I'd always been an accessory in her life, a tool when useful, an afterthought when not. Before I could respond, I heard another voice. "Your mother's right, Avon." I turned. My father stood in the doorway, arms crossed, looking more tired than usual, but his voice was firm. "You're overreacting," he said. "You're not a victim here." I blinked at him. He stepped forward, his tone sharper now. "Your grandfather wouldn't have appreciated that house. You did all that for what? To make yourself feel better? You should be grateful we handled it for you." I felt the air leave my lungs. Grateful. He actually said it. My mother placed a hand on his arm, murmuring something under her breath, but he shrugged her off. His gaze locked on me, cold and unflinching. You need to stop seeing yourself as some kind of savior, Avon. You gave us money, and we used it where it mattered. End of story. I realized then I'd been arguing with a wall all my life, a polite, well-spoken wall that looked like my parents. I looked at them both, standing there together, unified, justifying. And I said nothing, no anger, no accusation. I stood up from the table slowly, ignoring their protests, their attempts to call me back. Their words blended into background noise. In my mind, only one truth echoed. They hadn't just stolen money. They'd stolen the belief that family meant safety. I walked past them. Outside, I found Grandpa Jonah in the garden, kneeling beside his tomato plants like he always did when the weather allowed. His hands moved slowly, methodically, clearing weeds he'd already cleared yesterday. He looked up when he heard me, his expression soft, patient. Without thinking, I dropped to my knees beside him and hugged him, tight. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. And I didn't tell him, not yet, because right then, holding him, I knew. He was the only reason I had left to keep fighting. That morning, I knew I had one choice left: expose them. After that morning, after leaving Grandpa in the garden, I went straight to my childhood bedroom and locked the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor for what felt like hours. The sunlight shifted across the worn carpet, the same one I used to sit on cross-legged with school books, back when I thought this house meant safety. Now, it felt like a cage. At first I felt rage, raw, shaking, useless rage. My hands curled into fists against my thighs until they ached. But rage didn't last. It never does. Not when the people who hurt you are the same ones who once told you bedtime stories. What followed was worse. Disbelief. Helplessness. I ran through everything in my mind, over and over, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, that there had to be a reason, an explanation, anything that made sense. But there wasn't. Then came the thought I hated most. Maybe silence is safer. Maybe walking away would hurt less than what would come next. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, hearing nothing but the hum of the heater kicking on, the muffled voices of my parents somewhere below, as if nothing had happened. A soft knock pulled me from that spiral. I sat up. Slowly. "Come in," I said, but my voice cracked. The door opened. Grandpa Jonah stood there, holding an envelope. His expression was gentle, careful, like he was the one afraid of breaking me now. "I found this yesterday," he said quietly, holding it out. "Didn't want to worry you, but I thought maybe you should see." I took it. My fingers trembled. He left without another word, closing the door softly behind him. I opened the envelope, medical bills, but not just his. My name. On forged documents. Payments that shouldn't exist, from accounts I didn't authorize, all tied to Grandpa's treatments. They'd used me. Not just stolen from me, but used my identity to drain what little he had left. I sat there, clutching the papers, unable to breathe. "I didn't want to worry you," Grandpa had said. For a long time, I did nothing, until something shifted inside me. If I stayed quiet, I became them. If I spoke, I risked losing whatever scraps of family I had left. But silence wasn't love. Silence was betrayal. I stood up. That decision felt heavier than anything I'd ever done. But I made it. I waited until just before dinner. When I knew my mother would be busy in the kitchen and my father would be pretending to read his newspaper, I slipped out of the house, drove into town. The streets were mostly empty. Thanksgiving night leaves small towns like ours quiet. But I remembered one name, Prescott. I'd helped him years ago, when he was fresh out of law school, volunteering at the community center. I remembered he'd once said, "If you ever need help, real help, come find me." I hoped he meant it. His office light was still on. I parked, walked in. He looked up from his desk, surprised, then concerned the moment he saw my face. "Avon? What's wrong?" I didn't sit. I just held out the envelope. "I think my parents are defrauding my grandfather," I said, voice flat, "and using my name to do it." He took the papers silently. I watched the shift in him, the way his casual expression hardened, the way his posture straightened. He flipped through the documents carefully, methodically, then looked at me, his voice low and even. "This isn't just theft," he said. "It's elder abuse, financial exploitation, identity theft. All of it. This is serious, Avon." I nodded, because I already knew. "Do you believe me?" I asked, even though I hadn't planned to, even though it made me sound small. He looked me in the eye. "Yes." I sat down then, because for the first time in days, someone did. He promised discretion. He promised to help. And I believed him, because he had no reason to lie. By the time I signed the first set of documents, the start of the legal process that might save Grandpa or destroy whatever was left of my family, the sky outside had turned the color of steel. I watched my hand move across the page, steady. That night, I signed my first legal document not as a daughter, but as a plaintiff. That morning, I poured my coffee in silence. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in, though nothing had changed except me. My parents moved around stiffly. Mom shuffled past me to reach the sink. Dad adjusted the paper but didn't really read it. Nobody spoke. I didn't need them to. I sat down at the table, sipping slowly. I didn't look up when Mom placed a half-hearted plate of eggs in front of me. The tension in the air was something you could taste. And for once, it wasn't me holding it all together. I think they felt it, that shift. They couldn't name it, but they felt it. They'd lost me, and they knew. The knock at the door came just before the clock hit 9. At first, nobody moved. I could see Mom stiffen, then Dad's fingers clenched around the edge of the newspaper. I stood up, walked to the front door, opened it. A courier. "Ms. Avon Lark?" "Yes." He handed me the thick envelope and left. Simple as that. When I returned to the kitchen, I said nothing. I laid the envelope square in front of my mother's plate. Sat back down. She stared at it for a long, long time, then opened it. I watched her hands tremble as she read. Dad leaned over, read past her shoulder, and then it hit him too. "Who sent this?" His voice cracked. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. But my silence, that said everything. Prescott's letter was simple and devastating. His firm now formally demanded an immediate accounting of Grandpa's financial status, missing funds, rerouted payments, delayed health care, and a note. If documentation wasn't provided, a court subpoena would follow. Mom's lips moved, but no sound came. Dad shot to his feet, knocking his chair back against the wall. "Who did this?" I looked at Mom. Not at him. Just her. And for the first time in my life, I saw fear in her that had nothing to do with me failing her expectations. This fear was pure. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Dad's anger boiled over. "This is your doing. You think you're saving him? You're tearing this family apart, Avon." I sipped my coffee. Quiet. Unshaken. He slammed a fist onto the table, making plates rattle. "Answer me. Say something." Still nothing. Then Mom found her voice. but it was worse than Dad's rage. Hers came in soft, sweet venom. "Sweetheart, he's confused. Your grandfather's sick. You're making things harder for him. For all of us. If you really love this family," her voice cracked for effect, "you'd stop this now. Please. Before it's too late." I looked her dead in the eyes. "I did love this family. You burned that silence yourselves." Then I stood, walked around the table, reached for Grandpa's hand, who'd been standing there watching, saying nothing, like always. His fingers folded into mine without hesitation. Mom broke. Tears poured down her cheeks as she shook her head. "Avon, please, please don't do this." But I'd stopped hearing her. I led Grandpa out of that kitchen, step by step, leaving my father's curses and my mother's sobs behind me. In the backyard, where the frost still clung to the grass, Grandpa and I stood quietly. He didn't ask why I was shaking. He just held my hand a little tighter. I didn't tell him anything yet. I couldn't. But as the cold air burned my lungs, I knew exactly why I was still standing. Because of him. That night, after Grandpa had gone to sleep, and after the house had grown dark and silent, they knocked on my bedroom door. Not shouting this time. Soft. Begging. "Avon, please, we need to talk." I sat there on the bed, staring at the door, and did nothing. They knocked again. I reached over, locked it. And that night, when they begged me to talk, I locked my door. By morning, I was no longer surprised when they knocked. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the grain of the wooden door, listening to their whispers outside. My mother's voice, low and pleading. My father's, sharp and angry. It didn't matter anymore. Eventually, the whispers stopped. The silence didn't. Hours passed. I stayed in my childhood bedroom, curtains drawn, light off, breathing steady but heavy. I wasn't hiding. Not now. I was waiting. A soft scrape against the floor broke that silence. I looked down. A letter. Handwritten. Folded neatly, slid under my door like we were strangers passing notes in a prison. I picked it up. My name was written on the front in my mother's handwriting. I opened it. "You are no longer our daughter." That was the first line. The rest blurred for a moment. Then I forced myself to read every word. They weren't just cutting me off. They were warning me, accusing me, claiming I'd manipulated Grandpa, that I was mentally unstable, that if I didn't drop everything, they'd file for a protective order against me for elder exploitation. I sat down on the floor, letter in hand, and tried to breathe through the shaking. My chest burned. They weren't trying to stop the truth. They were trying to erase me. I didn't cry. Not yet. Not until I heard Grandpa. His voice, soft and confused, outside the door. "Avon, why won't they let me see you? Did I do something wrong?" That's what broke me. I pressed my forehead to the door, fists clenched against the wood, silent tears running down my face. "No, Grandpa. You didn't do anything wrong." They did. That night, after what felt like forever, the house finally quieted down. I unlocked the door. Grandpa was sleeping in his chair near the window, holding the old photo of Grandma in his lap. I sat beside him and cried quietly until my body stopped shaking. I realized then, this fight wasn't about me. It never had been. It was about him. My phone vibrated against my thigh. A message. Then another. "Attorney Prescott. We need to speak. Situation changed." Sheriff Marshall requests to meet. I wiped my face, stood up, and moved silently to pack the documents into my bag. Grandpa stirred, blinking sleepily, but said nothing as I knelt and kissed his forehead. "I'll be back soon," I whispered. I didn't tell him where I was going. I drove into town without music, without air, just the hum of tires against cracked asphalt. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. The sheriff's office sat quiet at the edge of Main Street. The old building looked small but solid, like nothing could shake it. I sat in my car outside for a few minutes, letting my heartbeat settle before stepping inside. Sheriff Marshall met me in the small waiting area. He wasn't young, wasn't old. His handshake was firm but gentle, and his eyes serious. "Come on back, Ms. Lark." In the small office, he didn't waste time. He'd already spoken with Prescott. He'd already reviewed the initial evidence, and he said it plain, without dressing it up. "What's happened here isn't just a family dispute, it's a crime. Your parents are under investigation for elder abuse, fraud, and identity theft. And you're not the accused, Avon. You're the witness." I nodded, though it didn't feel real. "Do you understand what that means?" he asked gently. I swallowed hard. "I do. You're safe. You're protected now." That's when my body gave out. Not literally, but inside. The weight dropped. My arms felt heavy. My throat tightened. Because someone official, finally believed me. I stayed there longer than I thought I would. Paperwork. Statements. Quiet explanations. Sheriff Marshall kept his tone steady, professional, but human. He didn't ask why I'd waited so long to speak. He understood without me saying it. By the time I stepped out of that office, the sun was slipping low behind the courthouse, casting long shadows down Main Street. I stood on the sidewalk, breathing in the cold evening air, letting it fill my lungs until it hurt. I wasn't prey anymore. For the first time, my parents had to fear me. By the time I woke up the next morning, everything felt heavier. The air, my own skin. Even the sunlight leaking through the curtains seemed like it didn't want to touch me. I hadn't planned on eating. But the knock on my door wasn't food. It was Prescott. His voice, calm but firm over the phone. "They've filed a counter-complaint, Avon." I sat down slowly on the edge of my bed. "What do you mean?" He didn't sugarcoat it. "Your parents are accusing you of elder financial abuse, manipulating your grandfather. Sheriff Marshall is required to investigate both sides now." I said nothing. What was there to say? "They're cornered," Prescott added gently. "Expect them to claw." I wanted to argue, to ask how they could twist everything so easily, but the truth settled fast. Of course they could. If there's one thing my parents were good at, it was rewriting reality, and this time I was their target. When I finally hung up, I felt hollow. They're going to rewrite me as the villain. The thought came unbidden, circling like a vulture, and it stayed. Even as I wandered downstairs, seeing Grandpa by the window, quietly sipping his morning tea, his eyes clouded in confusion, he didn't know how to explain. Even as Delora and Rylan moved through the house, pretending nothing was wrong, I sat next to Grandpa. My hands shook. "Did I do something bad, Avon?" he asked softly. I broke then. Not outwardly, not where anyone could see. But inside I crumbled. Because it wasn't just about me. They weren't just trying to erase me. They were using him as a pawn in the process. And that was worse. That's when Grandpa reached into his cardigan pocket and pulled out something small. A photograph. Faded now, edges worn. I recognized it instantly. It was the picture I'd drawn when I was a child. A shaky image of a lake house, stick figures of me and Grandpa standing in front of it. I'd written across the bottom in big, uneven letters, "Me and Grandpa at the lake house someday." I remembered giving it to him. I'd forgotten until that moment. "I kept it," he said quietly. "Always figured. Someday." That word, someday. Something shifted inside me. I stood up, kissed his forehead, and walked back upstairs. That photograph clutched tight in my hand. I wasn't letting them steal that promise, too. A knock sounded again. This time it wasn't a threat. Sheriff Marshall stood outside, his expression unreadable. He held out an envelope. Court summons. Inside were 2 documents, one for Delora and Rylan, summoning them as defendants in a case of elder abuse and fraud, and one for me, primary witness. Prescott's note was simple. "Your silence protected them. Your testimony will end them." I didn't feel powerful reading that. I felt tired. But something steady, something colder, settled inside me. This time, I wouldn't stay quiet. I drove back to the house that evening, papers in my bag, voice rehearsed not in words but in willpower. Delora was in the kitchen. Rylan stood by the door. Both looked up when I walked in. Neither spoke. I set the papers calmly on the table. "I won't let you rewrite me," I said softly. "Not this time." Delora's response was swift. She slapped me. Hard. I didn't flinch. Rylan stepped forward, starting to speak, but I cut him off, reading aloud. Word for word, the court summons. Delora's face drained of color. Rylan's fists tightened, but his words failed him. I laid the documents flat on the table. "See you in court." Delora screamed as I turned and walked out. I didn't look back. By the time their trial began, I was no longer their daughter. I was their reckoning. The courthouse smelled like old wood and tension. I walked in alone. Prescott had offered to meet me at the door, but I said no. I needed to take those steps myself. Voices buzzed around me. Neighbors I hadn't seen in years sat in the gallery. Some looked at me with curiosity, others pity, and some judgment. Delora was already seated at the defense table. Her eyes locked on me the second I entered. There was no warmth in them, only the cold fury of someone whose lies were losing their power. Rylan sat beside her, staring straight ahead, jaw clenched. He hadn't looked at me since the morning I left the lake house. I took my seat next to Prescott. He leaned in slightly and whispered, "Stay calm. Facts win." I nodded, but my hands betrayed me, trembling in my lap as the judge entered. Judge Mercer wasn't a large man, but the silence that followed him carried weight. "Case number 265B, the clerk announced. State versus Delora and Rylan Lark." Then my name. Avon Lark, primary witness. The world shifted slightly under my feet. When I was called to testify, I stood. Prescott didn't have to coach me. He knew this wasn't about legal strategy anymore. This was survival. I told the truth. Not just about the house, not just about the missing deed or the stolen money. I spoke about years of silences, of small betrayals that felt like love until you looked closely. I spoke about Grandpa, his confusion, his trust, the promises he barely remembered and the ones he clung to. When I pulled out the photograph, the one I'd given him as a child, you could feel the air shift in the room. That crumpled paper felt heavier than the ledgers and forged documents Prescott had entered into evidence. I held it up. "I gave this to my grandfather when I was 7 years old," I said, my voice steady, though my throat burned. "I told him someday we'd sit together at our lake house." I paused. My mother stared at the table, motionless. "I bought that house for him, and I trusted my parents to deliver it. They didn't." I looked directly at Delora. I stayed quiet because I thought that's what good daughters do. I stayed quiet because I thought family meant safety. Silence filled the courtroom. I finished quietly. They used my silence against me. Prescott rested his hand on the table. No words. No more questions. Delora stood up suddenly, trembling. Her voice cracked as she insisted, "None of this happened. She's twisting everything. She's trying to destroy us." The judge raised one hand. His voice was calm. "Sit down, Mrs. Lark." And just like that, it ended. Judge Mercer's ruling was swift. Deliberate fraud, elder financial abuse, theft. The court finds both defendants guilty. The sentences followed. Delora received 2 years. Not enough, I thought at first. But Prescott squeezed my arm lightly. "She'll serve every day," he whispered. "Trust me." Rylan wasn't sent to jail, but he was fined heavily and stripped of any legal control over Grandpa's finances. When the judge declared me full owner of the lake house, I barely reacted. By then, the house itself had stopped mattering. "Miss Lark," the judge said, looking directly at me, "would you like to make a closing statement?" I stood. My grandfather once told me that family is where you're safe, not where you're silenced. Then I sat down. Nothing more. The silence in that room said enough. Later that evening, I returned to the lake house. Alone, except for Grandpa. He sat out on the porch, looking at the water. I joined him without a word. Inside the house, above the mantel, I hung the photograph. The one from years ago. Promise kept. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. But for the first time, the silence between us felt like peace. In that quiet, I understood something I never had before. Justice had come. But justice doesn't heal you. It frees you to begin. And that night, sitting beside the man who'd taught me what love should look like, I knew my life wasn't about being someone's daughter anymore. It was about being me. What would you have done if your own family turned you into a ghost? Tell me your story. I'm listening.